Hey, everybody, and welcome to this urgent panel discussion from Critical Insight. My name is Jake Milstein, and I run the events for all of our urgent panels. I got to tell you all, this one is a little bit different. When we've done urgent panels previously, they've been about one incident, like the Log4j, or when there's all of a sudden a very prolific ransomware gang.
Or a new
Um,
grant.
yeah, they've been very specific to one thing. There have been so many things that have happened so far in October, and we're not even half done. That we felt like, okay, we got it. We got some questions from customers, we got some questions from others, and we thought we would just say, okay, let's just have one where we tackle all of them instead of trying to do three different webinars, three different panel discussions. And so, as people come into the room, so we're going to tackle all three today. I'll go through what they are. But our goal here is to tackle all three. Feel free to ask questions as we go, and we appreciate you joining us. There is a chat on the right. You can mute the chat if you want. Sometimes the questions go flying and people are discussing things. I think it's one of the livelier, more interesting part of the urgent panels where people are talking to each other. But there's a little bell button in the chat. If you click on the chat, and you can mute it if it's going ding, 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 and you want it to stop. Also, everybody who's here will get a recording. If you've registered for it, the system will send you a recording. If it happens that the system doesn't send you a recording and you want one, you can email me, jake@criticalinsight.com. I'll put my email address in the chat, and you can get that. Also, I just looked at the deck and looked at the slides that Fred and Mike put in. A lot of folks are going to want the slides, and so we will also send out a PDF of the slides today. And if people want more, let us know. Happy to help. Okay. So who are we? Critical Insight defends critical services against cyber attack. We do it through cybersecurity as a service. We always tell folks that they need to prepare for an attack, they need to be able to detect an attack quickly, and they need to be able to respond rapidly. And we do that through a group of services. But this is not a sales webinar. We're here to talk about some urgent things. So joining us today, Mike Hamilton. Mike Mike and Fred are both company founders. Mike is the CISO here, and he was the CISO of the city of Seattle, and Mike so many more things than that. Fred Langston is again a founder. He's the chief product officer. He ran our consulting practice for a long time. And specifically for today, Fred has a very long background in healthcare cybersecurity, working on the committee that created the first HIPAA security rule, and he's been working with healthcare organizations, hospitals for I can say 10 years, and it'll make Fred seem younger, but really it's 30 years. So 30 years. And I'm the Critical Insight event host, public speaker, and I take your questions. And the way this works is as we go, if you put questions in the chat, I interrupt them and ask your questions and keep it lively for folks who are putting in the chat where they're from. Thanks. Love to know where people are coming from.
Yeah, this is cool.
I'm in a basement in Seattle, because that's where I've been since 2020 began. So we're going to talk about three major stories today. We're going to talk about the CommonSpirit Health breach. We're going to talk about the Microsoft Exchange 0-day. We're going to talk about the Uber security chief, and Q&A is sort of a funny thing to put at the end because we'll be doing it through the whole thing.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to hit an issue, we're going to talk about it, then we'll go to the next one, then we'll go to the next one, and then we'll loop back at the end on all of them. Some of this will be, and I see in the audience here, some folks are IT security experts. Some folks, there's a couple of CEOs, CFOs. We're going to go into, certainly on the 0-day, we're going to go into some depth there, security wise. If you have questions and you want to know what something means, put it in the chat.
And let me just add, and I think this is something that we should always say, a lot of you are credentialed, and this is worth an hour of continuing professional education.
There you go. Okay. All right. So the CommonSpirit Health breach. Mike, do you want to go through what's happened here?
I will. This is probably the biggest. When we find out everything there is to find out about this, and right now there's not a whole lot of information being provided. I'm sure we're going to find out that this is the largest that's ever occurred. So all three of those headlines came out the same day, and I think this is an interesting juxtaposition of things, right? So yeah, the day that it said, well, we're having an IT security issue, approximately the day before, they had posted a $1 billion operating loss, which is common in the health sector right now. The health sector is on the ropes between revenue down and margins down and having to pay traveling nurses instead of staff nurses. Hospitals are having a real hard time, so they posted that operating loss, and the day later they said they issued a $1.5 billion bond. So I don't know if the event that's going on right now is going to impede their ability to raise funds, because they certainly need to raise funds. But CommonSpirit is let's just call it a parent company of a whole bunch of health sector, and it provides a lot of shared services, and one of those is electronic health records. And so they are now, as of yesterday, they admitted this is ransomware, and this has been going on for a week, and they haven't said that yet, right? We all knew that. Uh, but in today's world, it's common that when you get hit with ransomware, you first have records stolen, and the criminals then, when you start to negotiate with them, will say, "Look, if you don't pay us, we're going to make all this stuff public." That's the negotiating that's going on right now. And the FBI is in there, and insurance company is in there, and everybody's trying to make this thing come back online so that all of the other hospitals that depended on the EHR system provided by CommonSpirit can go back to doing business without pencil and paper. Because right now, if you go to a hospital and you had, I don't know, a chemo session scheduled, they're having to reschedule. They there's no record now that says, here are the antibiotics I'm allergic to. So things are very sketchy in the health sector right now in the United States because of this. And so it's up to 1,000 hospitals. And again, because they're not really putting out any information at all, we don't have a lot of information to go on. All I know is St. Michael's right down the road in Silverdale can't operate. Virginia Mason across the water over in Seattle can't operate.
Well,
Um,
so they have 140 hospitals and 1,500 healthcare sites. Some of them are affected more than others. I
more
don't.
than
I
that's true.
some of them are on. Some of them do have an EHR. Some don't. And Fred, and just so everybody knows, Fred's internet has gone in and out. So Fred, I think you're back here now. So Fred, when you see this CommonSpirit breach, this is big. This affects a lot of folks. How do how do you see this?
Well, I think it shows the interconnectivity of systems, and it's analogous to Tyler Tech in government, and a system that is providing all these back end services to hospitals. When that goes down, an entire hospital, and I won't call it a hospital network, but a network of hospitals that use this common provider all go down. So you need to think about what your weak links are, especially if it's you're outsourcing a particular component. You need to understand, if that provider no longer is able to provide service, what does it mean to your operations? What do you need to do to recover from that provider's outage?
And one there so when this all started, Fred, there was a rumor going around that this was actually a breach at the EHR provider, and I think it was Epic, although I'm not 100% sure. And it turned out that no, it was not a breach at the EHR level. It was a breach of CommonSpirit, right?
Yeah, as far as we know, but again, this is still, they're not being completely forthcoming yet,
And they
but
don't have to.
and they don't have to,
Right.
right? But I think what it points out is the EHRs were not accessible, right? So while it may not fall on one particular entity's shoulders, as a hospital, you still can't access your EHR, right? And that's catastrophic.
Yeah, and frankly, that last bullet there is worth digging into a little bit, because What we saw in our last healthcare data breach report, when we did an analysis, was a shift towards more of a we've seen this shift of coming in through third parties, right? That's the unlocked window, and there's a network of trust that you can exploit there, and that's been happening more and more. But lately it's going to the service providers for lots of health sector, and grabbing everything right there. And the downside of that is every individual healthcare provider is then going to file a data breach report. Okay, that's what happened last time with Blackbaud. This may be a little different, right? Where CommonSpirit is going to own the whole thing, but we're talking about a lot of records here, and cleaning up a records breach is super expensive for a company that posted $1 billion loss and is probably going to have difficulty raising money. So now, this is conjecture, but if I was a nation state hostile to the United States and I really wanted to mess up the social fabric of the country, here's a really good way to do it.
Yeah. I'd point out too that before this breach, I don't know if this is going to be one of the largest of the year, but the second largest of this year was at a company called Professional Finance Company.
That's right.
And it
That's
was a
fintech
collector.
too.
Yep, I was a collector of medical debt. So it was an organization that really didn't even think of themselves as playing in the healthcare space. They had 650 healthcare organizations' information stolen, and all 650 of those had to report that data breach as a breach of theirs because it was a third party in which they had a business associate agreement with. So people may think that your liability is limited to things that happen to you, and that is just not the case when it comes to healthcare.
And Fred, let's thinking about the CommonSpirit possibilities here. So they turned off their EHR in a lot of locations so that they're using paper records at this point. That does not mean that ransomware is in the EHR. Does it? I mean, it could mean that they did that so that the ransomware wouldn't spread into other systems. How do you see that?
So, I mean, you look at it two ways. It could be any number of reasons that the EHR is unavailable, right? It could be data corruption. It could be that it was ransomware. It could be that they have locked down some particular part of the system that doesn't allow those records to reach the endpoints. But the bottom line is you're out of your EHR, right? So fixing blame is ultimately down the road when the law dogs get involved. That's what's going to happen. But really, this is about, does your CMO, your chief medical officer, understand what to do if there's a breach that isn't even yours, but that is preventing you from giving care? Moving to pencil and paper is a viable, but you cannot handle the volume of clients. Especially if there's, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're heading into the flu season. Kids are back at school, injuries are up. All these things are going to start impacting the volume of patients they can see. And if you slow down to pencil and paper, you're probably going to be diverting patients or canceling elective surgeries.
And I mean, and I mean, Fred and Mike, no matter what industry you're in, healthcare, not healthcare, people there, talk about what kind of preparation, seeing this, everybody should know, oh, wow, everybody should recognize, okay, if CommonSpirit was breached, anyone can be breached. It's a big organization. What, and typically what we see is small rural hospitals being breached because they don't have the same kind of security posture. This is a big organization that got breached, right? So how do you prepare for something like this, knowing you don't know how long you're going to be on paper records? What does incident preparation look like, and how do you use this to talk to folks about incident preparation?
Yeah. So I love taking these examples and using them both to develop an incident response plan and then doing a tabletop exercise on the back end. And I can't stress enough how valuable the tabletop exercises have been. And if you're doing it, you have to ensure this is, especially in a hospital environment, is only limited. I mean, the IT involvement is limited here. You need to have the chief medical officer involved. You need to have potentially the nursing chief of nursing involved. All these people are going to make critical care decisions in a split second based on a cyber incident if they can't provide care. If you want to get their attention, and I will tell you, I've been helping healthcare security for my entire career. Getting the attention of the chief medical officer has been next to impossible, because if you can't convince that person, who is considered probably the most important person at the hospital, convinced that this stuff is critical to patient care. It's not some esoteric, hey, we're going to pay a fine. No, I'm going to have a patient that I'm going to have to ship off to another hospital, and they may die in the way. So getting this message across to the people that are the caregivers at these organizations can rapidly change minds. And they realize, I have to make 10 incredibly impactful decisions as a non-IT person that I didn't even realize were things I'm going to have to consider. So all the decisions should be made in advance in a tabletop exercise. So during a crisis, you're not figuring out, do we pay the ransom? Do we shut down the hospital? Do we start transferring patients? Do we kill elective surgeries? Those should be answered before this all happens. And you can't do that unless you run through a tabletop exercise. You're faced with these scenarios, and you're faced with having to make these decisions. I think more than anything else, that is the most important thing, to prepare yourself for a rapid response, ending the incident as quickly as possible, and minimizing the impact, right?
So I would say, so what Fred said, and definitely when you tabletop things, right, you're trying to maintain continuity of the services you provide. So health, not health, doesn't matter. There's a certain thing your business or your government agency does, and that's the key thing you want to keep doing. And so the technology that facilitates that thing, frankly, you need offline copies of all that stuff that are as synced up as possible and ready to swap in if everything gets melted. And that would include your Active Directory so that users can authenticate. That would include, your EHR system, frankly. It also includes your backups, which need to be immutable, offsite, as protected as they can be. So that's really the key, frankly, to me, is focusing on what are those things that are going to allow you to continue to complete your mission, which in this case is patient care, right? Everything else that's going to be happening in the background, right? There's going to be an insurance company in there. They're going to be calling the shots. They're going to be, the smoke jumpers are going to show up with their Q-tips and toothpicks. All that stuff is going to happen. But for patient care to continue, or, if you're in local government, right, for the services that you provide, which some of these are trivial but super important, like permitting. Permitting is a super important service. Got to be there. Focus on those things. And this, we're gonna see how this ends up. And we do not know all the details around this yet. And John Traeger made a really good point about middleware that is bolted onto EHR systems as well. And that could have been the source of this. And that's actually entirely plausible.
Mike had one good point there that I really
But
want to
only
emphasize
one.
to people. Only one, but it was have an offline Active Directory domain controller synced up and ready to go. A lot of people don't have that. If you want to recover rapidly, the first thing that needs to come back is your ability to grant access and people access to this information. If you have an offline copy that you're keeping synced, if your entire network is flattened, rebuilding that infrastructure, the AD infrastructure, is going to take you a week. If you have an offline controller sitting there, you can swap it in within 10 minutes and be back online. That's almost a no-brainer, and I just don't see it often enough in places.
And before we leave this, the other shoes that will drop after this. So like I said, Blackbaud was a long time ago, was the poster child for, we service a whole lot of organizations. They got whacked. Every individual healthcare customer of theirs had to file an individual data breach report. And then they class actioned Blackbaud. Well, now, depending on things like, are there any California residents that are, because if records have been stolen, they're going to be made public. They're negotiating to not let that happen right now. If they get made public, we just saw the very first class action suit against Samsung using the California Consumer Privacy Act, California Privacy Rights Act, because there's language in there that says you do not have to show harm if your record was disclosed in order to have standing. And so there are attorneys waiting for these things to happen going, bet there was California people in there. And we can, along with the, the loss, the inability to raise funds, what it's going to cost to recover from this, there could be a class action suit coming as well.
Which, by the way, in some ways is very frustrating because,
And
as
and
security,
very self-defeating
because,
too.
I mean, as security professionals, that, look, we're going to get to Uber in a little bit. Some of these things are self-inflicted wounds and some aren't. Like sometimes the bad guys are just really good, and the victim organization is just that, a victim of a crime. And you cannot prevent all crime. There's no way to prevent all crime. We know this. And so it's some of that sometimes is very frustrating. Okay. I do want to get to the next thing, which is the Exchange 0-day thing. If folks from healthcare have more questions about CommonSpirit, put it in the chat. Happy to go back to it, but I want to make sure we get through all three things. Fred, go ahead.
Okay, so just to make sure everybody knows what a 0-day actually is. A 0-day is a vulnerability that no one had ever heard about, had not been published. The manufacturers of the technology where the vulnerability lies don't know about it. And it's unleashed on the world as something that nobody knows how to defend, nobody knows how to detect, and nobody yet knows how to respond to. So this is kind of your nuclear threat. The worst thing that can possibly happen is a 0-day vulnerability, especially in something that is widely used, like Exchange, for example, or Epic. If they were to have a 0-day, there's a huge number of users using that. So these 0 days can affect the entire world when they come out. This particular 0-day is one for Exchange. There was one a year and a half ago that was called ProxyShell. This one's called ProxyNotShell. So just to make it more confusing, unfortunately, for everybody. But the name is really not all that important, to just know that this is the vulnerability, the 0-day du jour that people need to be aware of and address. It's actually two vulnerabilities that make up this exploit, and they're chained together to actually conduct the attack. So we have a server-side request forgery vulnerability, which is something in how the application is built that allows you to forge requests on the server side. And then they tie that into a remote code execution, which means I don't have to be on the system, but I can execute code. That code I execute can do the things I want it to do, nefarious things like send out data, attack other systems, all other sorts of things that lead to worse outcomes. So taking these two together, two 0-day vulnerabilities chained together, we realize that you're able to make and conduct this attack, which then can lead to complete compromise of your Exchange server. What is really scary is there are no patches out right now. There was patch Tuesday that came out this week. We're all waiting and getting ready to cheer and say, everybody go out and patch. Finally, there's a patch release. Nope, no patch this week. There were a bunch of other 0 days, one of them a 10 out of 10 in how bad it was severity that was patched, but it wasn't this set of 0-day vulnerabilities. So what do we do in that case? The same thing we always do when there's a 0-day and there's no patch. First, we determine, should the system remain in service? Do we just pull that system down until a patch is available? With something like an Exchange server, that is a legitimate question, because if they get their Exchange server, they probably are going to get a storehouse of data that can potentially put you out of business, at least with the value of data they would be able to steal. So that's a very thorny question. Then the next statement is there a mitigating measure? Well, Microsoft has published some mitigations. They're okay. They'll probably help you survive this, but it's going to be a lot of work. One of them is a URL rewrite rule mitigation. And then let's just disable remote PowerShell for non-admins. Frankly, that's a no-brainer. That probably should be in place anyways in your organization. So some of these are, well, heck, we should have probably have had that in place anyways. And this is a great way to find out, well, maybe we didn't. Good news is you need authenticated access to do this, okay? So meaning I can't just attack a system on the internet. I need to have a foothold. I need to have an account on that. So if I have a compromised account, or if somebody has a laptop that is connected up to that Exchange server, and I attack the laptop, I can then use that as a launch point to launch the same attack. And that way I can actually kind of, to some degree bypass, hitting it directly from the internet. I can go through a user who's connected's laptop to get to that system and attack it. So the mitigations, that they publish, and I'll get to that on the next page, is part of what we do, but also we need to increase monitoring, especially if you're going to leave an unpatched Exchange server with this vulnerability on the internet. You need to have almost full-time eyes on that system, watching all the things happening on it to make sure things aren't showing you indicators of compromise. Microsoft has published a big list. There's a real nice list they have. You can go to their site, and it says, here are the things to look for. Here's the things Defender may tell you. Here are the things that are anti-malware security management interface, which can actually also connect in and do some scanning. It will alert on these things. If you see these things, they're signs of either new infection or worse, persistence, meaning, well, the guy's on here, they're already here, they're starting to build back doors. So when you kick them out the front door, they still have a bunch of back doors in there. You need to go close those as well. So you need to have full eyes on, full monitoring. You need people looking at this data in real time to look for these signs and look for these kinds of alerts coming off of things like Defender. Still no Exchange Online, not affected. Small, thank heavens for small.
And let me follow up a little bit there. For most organizations, it is highly unlikely you're running an endpoint agent on servers. It's just not a common thing. So when Fred's talking about monitoring and increased monitoring, the detection capability you need to have basically to detect zero-day is behavioral, right? So, and this AI, ML, whatever you want to call it, it's a statistical baseline of average behavior. And when something aberrational happens, it throws up an alert. So an example of that is you have Defender as your endpoint on a laptop. And Defender is, it's antivirus agents, just like everything, and it misses stuff. So you get something on there, and then later it wakes up and it starts to scan the network. Well, that scanning behavior has never happened before, so the alert goes up. And then if you have somebody to receive alert and investigate it, you can quarantine that asset and prevent it from, polluting the entire environment. But it's that what do we used to call it? UEBA, user and endpoint behavioral analysis. Now we call it ML, but it's really the same thing.
And hey, Fred and Mike, is there any clarity around who is exploiting this zero-day at this point?
No. Which is interesting because the last time Exchange was exploited at scale, it was definitely Chinese actors, supported by the state. And the story at the time was the vulnerabilities were announced on the stage at I think the Black Hat conference, and the scanning for vulnerable Exchange servers happened 5 minutes later, 5 minutes after the guy got off stage. So that's what kind of coordination you're working against.
And that explains too of their process, right? So that scanning that happened, I'm collecting information. I'm going to start storing it in a database. For the moment I or anybody else in the dark underworld publishes an exploit for this set of vulnerability. So the second there's a zero-day vulnerability, they're scanning, they're looking for it, they're cataloging this stuff, and they're all either waiting or working overtime to develop their own exploit. It's a race. It's a race between the Chinese, between 10 different gangs in Russia, between the North Koreans, the Iranians. It's a race between all of them to who can get to this first, because they know, A, the patch will come out someday that will take this vulnerability away. People will be putting mitigating measures in place at a particular pace. So the earlier, the faster they can strike, the higher their chances of success. So it's literally a global race on by pretty much every dark ransomware gang in the world trying to take advantage of these vulnerabilities.
And governments, and let's be inclusive, the U.S. included. We do it too.
And the U.S. included. Yeah.
Fred, next slide.
All right. So what kinds of things can we do? So there's some rule blocking or some blocking rules that you can add to IAS Manager. We'll talk, I think, on the next page a little bit about what that is. Ironically, the first published rule that Microsoft put out, they put out an update and said, yeah, that was not really going to do it. You need to use this rule. So even they didn't get it right on the first pass on getting that rule out there. Knowing again that, people already have to have a compromised account. The good news is it's probably going to be somebody who has their email account popped that will then be used. So if you can detect that somebody's been phished, fix that before they can actually take advantage of this, you potentially could get ahead of it. The attacks are relied on PowerShell commands, block ports 5985 and 5986 on your Exchange server, at least until this is passed. So this is one of those things you're going to put up. Okay, eventually it's going to get patched. We can put it down. You can start using PowerShell again. But in the meantime, let's not even have PowerShell access for non-admitted users in your organization. That's one of those things that probably nobody should have anyways. So this is kind of one of those wake-up calls that if you still have this, you need to fix it here, but you need to fix it, period, kind of thing. Next slide, Jake. Okay, it's stuck on my side, Jake.
Nope, it's up.
There it is. Okay. All right. So the problem with the filtering requests, it is a continuous whack-a-mole approach. Okay, as all of us create better rules, well, the attackers are working to find new bypasses. So if you want to take this approach, you kind of got to dedicate a resource to kind of keep their ear to the ground, find out what people are hearing. What do I do to increase or make better rules? What are the bad guys altering to get around them? What do I tweak to prevent them from doing that? So you can take that approach. It's very time intensive. There's the blocking rule there. I put it in hot pink. So that basically is the updated rule that you should use. But what we suggest, they've also published a PowerShell script. Use the published PowerShell script. I mean, everybody knows you can transpose one letter, you can get one character left out, and all of a sudden this rule does nothing, and you think you're fine. Just use the tool, folks. It makes it so it's a relatively foolproof process. And if you believe you have been compromised, Microsoft has the safety scanner you can download for free, and that will actually detect, in fact, if you've been compromised by this vulnerability. So go out there, get it. If you think something's fishy, take it and run it. There's also the Microsoft Anti-Malware scan interface. This is something a lot of people don't even know exists. In fact, a lot of systems, for example, Symantec's email scanning, they have an appliance that uses this interface to scan things on Exchange. That makes a lot of sense when you see the next bullet that many people, if not most of us, have probably excluded certain directories in Exchange from AV scans because it hits performance. So it was even a recommendation for a long time. Don't scan those directories, put them as an exclusion. Well, that turns out in this instance, that's really bad. Okay, now you are completely blind as to what's going on inside your Exchange server because you set an exception for this. So not only do we suggest take the performance hit for now, have it doing the scanning of your Exchange, but probably go through and audit all of your AV exclusions, especially for Exchange. And if you can take the performance hit, remove those. Okay, this is kind of old stuff that has kind of hung around and recommendations that have been carried forward and maybe are time to revisit some of these things that they weren't, they may have been important when we had limited performance, but systems are a lot more powerful today. So that's a key thing.
And
we have one more page.
Didn't you write a paper, Fred, on treating a 0-day vulnerability as an incident or something along those lines?
Yeah. So about a year ago, it was after this spate of like Log4j and ProxyShell and all that stuff. Here's the reality. If you have a critical risk vulnerability or critical severity vulnerability that is exposed on the internet, it is literally probably a matter of minutes or hours, at the most days, before some bad guy finds it and takes advantage of that. You need to treat those kinds of things as an incident. It's an incipient incident that is going to happen. If you get in front of it by getting out there, determining what's the risk, what do we need to do? Do we need to mitigate? Or in a best case scenario, let's do an emergency patch cycle. Because the bad guys, they read the requirements, like if you look at PCI or any of the requirements, say, got to patch within 30 days. The bad guys can read. They know that too. So they know my window is really that first 10 days. Ironically, it's 10 days now, not because they don't have that full 30 days, but because all the other competing bad guy gangs in the world are going to get there probably within 10 days. So you really have a tiny window now because the bad guys understand how we work. They take advantage of that, right? And then they're going to force our hand, as painful as it may be. They're going to force our hand to have to take a look at these and say, you know what, we're going to have to do an emergency patch. We're going to have to do something we would never normally do and avoid at all costs, but we have to because we're going to be forced into this by the bad guys taking advantage of our systems. So that's the concept on how do you prioritize these? Well, frankly, they're incidents, okay? Prioritize them as high as you can.
And by the way, and wait, and so speaking of that, you know, I'm looking through who's in the audience here. And sorry for flipping the screen around. I was trying to see who's here. And I know some of you, and I know you're in smaller organizations where you are the only IT person, or there are just a few of you in the IT security organization at your IT security department in your organization. There's one customer we have who took Fred's advice here, and there was a 0-day that came out. They called an incident. They got everybody in the organization involved. They did a really nice job of explaining it to the CEO, explaining it to everybody in the org, and they were a hero. Everybody, you know, they you know, they took things offline. They patched it. You know, it caused some pain, but everybody saw it as a, hey, let's do this together before the bad thing happens. Take Fred's advice. If you're in that IT job, you know, this is a good way to get to, as a wake up call to your org. Sorry, Fred.
And then continue to monitor. And if the attack came and you were patched, be sure and hold that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's the thing. What, you know, what would you look for from a technical perspective? And I'm not going to dig into what each of these mean. I'm going to talk about generically what is being discussed here. And one of them is, if you don't have the ability to scan for initial access, Exchange AMSI needs to be enabled. You will not see these 3 indicators of initial access. In other words, if you have it enabled and it can scan your Exchange server, it can tell you they're here. They just did this. We just saw it. That's the initial access. They have a foothold. That's you know, DEFCON 1. Let's run. Got to get out there. Got to kick them out. But a lot of times you may miss that, or potentially you didn't miss it, but you're still working to kind of fix the problem. There are other things that it can tell you, like persistence. So the things that say this is a persistence alert, that means the bad guys are building other ways into your system. They're putting the back doors, so when you go kick them out and shut the front door, they've got 3 side doors that they built in that they're going to be back in within 5 minutes later, and they're going to be taking over your system. So what you may need to do is not only worry about the initial access and throwing them out. I've got to go in now. If I've triggered any of these persistence elements, that's telling me I've got to go in and fix this. They built some back doors. I'm not done until these are out. And then we can actually see execution. This is when they're actually initiating a shell and starting to take action on your system, either exfiltrating data, attacking other systems, stealing credentials, all the bad things. That means they're actively starting to do the really bad stuff. So this is kind of showing you how it will roll out over time in a particular thing and help you to understand where are we in the life cycle of this threat. Where are we in the kill chain here? And what do we need to do to make sure the attackers are out, gone, we've closed all the back doors, and we know the bad things they were doing, and we've potentially addressed those things, like, hey, they were stealing data, or hey, they were stealing passwords. Next slide, Jake. Okay, one more here. And it's slowly, there we go. So what other things do we also want to look at? Again, there are other things that we can see, but looking through Defender, again, there are things like initial access, other things to look at, but it also just tell you how they're operating here. So you can understand kind of what things they're doing, what next places should you be looking, because again, this will probably not be confined, if they get to these later stages of the attack, won't be confined to the system. So if you see it running execution, a suspicious exchange process execution, that means they're probably trying to do something like steal passwords on active users every time they log in and out of your Exchange server, for example. So you may need to then say to yourself, well, heck, I've got to go now force password changes across everything, because it looks like it's possible that they were able to steal all the passwords, for example. So again, when you're working through these things, you need to be very methodical. You need to look at what Microsoft is telling you. What is the implication of these particular alerts? And is it telling us I need to do more than just I kicked the guy out the front door that got in through this vulnerability? So again, this is to have a very holistic view of this event. What you're seeing and the monitoring is key. You've got to have your monitoring, or you can't see any of this.
Hey, Fred, separate from this, Tammy has a healthcare question for you. My biggest fear is third-party business agreement data loss. My understanding is the hospital is still responsible for data, even out of house. And just so everybody knows, a business associate for a hospital is a third party.
And there's a legal document between every vendor, service provider, whatever, between a hospital, the covered entity. It's called a BAA, a business associate agreement, and there are terms and conditions there. But yeah, yes, you are right. The hospital is going to be the one that falls on sword publicly and does the data breach report.
Yeah, and this was all codified in the HIPAA High-Tech Act of 2007, when they finally said, we've always treated business associates kind of arm's length. It's on the hospital. Well, the government realized the business associates are as big, or maybe a bigger threat than the hospitals themselves. So now they can reach in and actually go after business associates, which was not the case in the past. And I can tell you, Professional Finance Company, which was a company that collected medical debt, actually had the second largest healthcare breach of the year. Oh, we don't hear about it because they are a medical debt collector, although they were under HIPAA, and they're going to have huge fines because 650 medical organizations all lost their data to this one business associate. All 650 of those organizations had to report a data loss to the OCR and the government and to the Attorney General. So absolutely, Tammy, you are absolutely on the hook for what happens at your business associates. That's why that business associate agreement should really be a robust document, not just a check the box exercise. And while you should be also running a third party security assessment process to make sure your vendors are maintaining their security. So while they may sign a business associate agreement today and be in compliance today, their new CIO came in and cut the budget, and 6 months later, they don't have any of that anymore. And if you don't know that, you're the one taking the risk for their business decisions.
Yeah, and in fact, here at Critical Insight, Mike, as CISO, has created a big checklist for vendors that don't have a SOC 2 to prove that they are as secure as possible. And happy to provide that Excel spreadsheet to folks if you want it. Just email me.
They're all over the place out there. The point is to make a point and say, if you haven't done your diligence and you haven't gone through the process of bringing in auditors to audit your controls, and all I have to do is go on your attestation, the process of attestation is going to suck. It's a big spreadsheet, and that's intentional.
It's a scary spreadsheet, but if you want it, I'll email it to you. Just email me, jake@criticalinsight.com. I'll send it over to you.
All right, okay. We got to get on the next thing here.
Go for it, Mike.
Okay. This has got a lot of people's attention for good reasons and for sensationalized reasons. Okay, so here's how this went down. Joe Sullivan is the Uber CISO who has been convicted and facing prison time and a big fine. Back in 2014, Uber had data breach, and the Federal Trade Commission came in and they're looking at stuff in there, and this is always going to be kind of the follow-up to a data breach now, because the federal government is getting very, very aggressive about enforcement. Yes, the regulatory environment is growing, largely being pushed by the finance sector, the SEC, FDIC, Notably, the state of New York Department of Financial Services is really plowing new ground there. And it's not just the mandatory reporting part, it's all kind. You must have someone responsible and accountable for security, somebody you've identified, right? So FTC is in Uber, looking around, probably going to enforce the False Claims Act at some point. And what they had done was they said, okay, while this is going on, you're basically under a consent decree. And any other event you will report to us, the FTC. Well, and then they had an event in 2016, and it was 57 million customers and 600,000 drivers all had their personally identifiable information, financial information, credit card details, all this stuff got, is out the door. And so what the CISO did was in negotiating with the bad guys, they said, we want $100,000 for all this stuff, which is cheap. And rather than, paying the ransom, which would have made everything public, and reporting it as they should have done to the FTC, or telling the bad guys, pound sand, here's what we're going to do. What they did was they negotiated with the gang and said, look, here's what we're going to do. We have a bug bounty program here at Uber. And if the way that you purloined all of this information, you tell us how you did that, and we call it a bug bounty, and we pay you $100,000 for the bug bounty, and you guarantee me that you're going to destroy all the information that you stole. And then the FTC found out about that, and they were hopping mad. And one of the reasons is because they had told Uber and Joe Sullivan specifically, you will be the one. You are the one responsible for telling us if something else happens, if there is another data breach, if you get ransomware, things like that. It's hard to hide ransomware, right? So they said, okay, you have covered up a felony, and they took him to trial for that. So he got fired. The internal attorney, general counsel working with him got fired and just replaced. And now he's been convicted. Now there's a lot of moving parts here. From the perspective of somebody who's in the CISO seat, they look at this. There's no reason for you to do anything differently because that dude lied. And it's easy to not lie, especially when regulators are in your business and you are under a consent decree. Okay, that judgmental flaw right there is pretty astonishing. So nobody, you don't need to go out and buy D&O insurance. However, the bigger thing to me, and yes, the SEC is going to look at their 10K filings to see if they reported material risk like they're supposed to. Federal Trade Commission is going to enforce False Claims Act, most definitely. But the big thing to me is he was not the only executive that knew what was going on. And he conspired with an attorney to do this. And they were not the only ones that knew what was going on. In fact, they had the CEO's fingerprints on this, and that CEO was replaced as well. So what we're talking about is not necessarily a crime. And what do they call it? There's a word for when you conceal a felony. I forgot it, but that was it. However, the claims of executive negligence are going to follow, and even though they say those were the old executives, it's still going to follow. And I have briefed senators, governors, generals, people from Congress, and know how to control the language so that they actually understand. And I can tell you that it does no good to go talk about SQL injection, identity access management, things like that. But when you say executive negligence, everybody's head pops up and has a look. So I think the upshot from this is going to be executives taking this a lot more seriously, especially publicly traded corporations in the filings where they have to represent risk to their shareholders. If we see a prosecution here and we see this thing going further, security budgets are going up.
Fred, what are your thoughts on the Uber security chief? And by the way, I do want to say before Fred gives his thoughts, one of the reasons this comes up that Mike alluded to in there, for those of you not deeply familiar with the story, is to a lot of people, having a security chief convicted was a big surprise. It was, oh my gosh, now CISOs can
Right. They
be
think it's
convicted.
because of the breach, right? And
Right.
it's not.
Mhm. Right. It's oh my gosh, every time there's a breach, the CISO is going to be convicted of a crime. That's not that's not quite what happened here. Fred, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I think one of the interesting parts is the initial article that really kind of got this going was about getting D&O insurance. So my personal belief is, Jake, I'm gonna stick you a little bit here. The marketing folks at an insurance company said, "Hey, this is a perfect opportunity for us to get this D&O insurance marketing plan out in the wild. Let's publish this stuff and say, boy, look what happened to this guy. You need to buy insurance." So my personal opinion is that this is being driven by insurance marketing more than anything. When I first saw it, I was incredulous, thinking this person clearly conducted criminal activity, in direct defiance of the U.S. government. I don't know anybody. I mean, I'm probably have met him, but I don't know anybody that is that crazy. So this just hit me as people. That's not what's going on here. This is somebody that acted with, frankly, either malice or extreme negligence, and is getting exactly what should happen. It has nothing to do with CISOs are now responsible.
Yeah, there's another in the news thing that is related to this, and especially the concept of executive negligence. So, Peter Zatko, Mudge, became a whistleblower about the lax controls inside Twitter, how anybody essentially had access to read people's direct messages, tromp around. And he kept raising his hand about this and now he's been in the business a long time and he knows how you do this, right? You have a governance organization and you say, I've identified a risk. I would like control for this risk to be resourced by the organization, right? It is above our threshold for acceptable risk. So let's do something about this. And if you've papered that and you've tried to send that up the food chain towards the board of directors and you just get shut down every time. So he became a whistleblower. And now we're going to probably see more claims of executive negligence against the Twitter executives. And I bet they are sweating bullets right now.
Yep. Okay. Hey, there is a question that came in back to healthcare, and I want to get back to that. Michael says, and Fred, this is for you, is it possible to force a third party to report a breach both publicly and to the OCR?
It's a good question.
So your BAA, baby, that's the entire purpose of the business associate agreement. You're supposed to be passing your HIPAA requirements that are on you as a covered entity should be transferred to your business associates so they know that they have to meet the identical standards. So not only does the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, under Department of Health and Human Services, the enforcement arm for HIPAA, they can now audit those business associates, but really your control is that agreement, right? And you have to have that ironclad in the agreement. So a lot of people, they've been using kind of like the boilerplate, BAA. Hey, this is going to get us, check the box, we're going to be done. Everybody uses this. No, you negotiate specific terms in there and don't sign an agreement if they're not willing to report to you within 48 hours that they have had a compromise of patient data. So again, your cudgel is that business associate agreement.
And I wonder if other sectors are going to pick up, a similar methodology here. I mean, because everything's about third-party security right now, right? Everybody's got to show everybody else your papers. You're supposed to do, annual third-party vendor risk assessment. And I wonder if it's going to start to be contractual that you need to, as you say, right? We have business associate agreements, right? Which means we can be audited against HIPAA.
Yep.
So, creating that expectation with your vendors, say, look, your attestation is all well and good, but here's what we expect, sign here. And then if something happens, there's a bit of a liability transfer that you can engage there.
All right. So Q&A, we've been doing Q&A through this. We're going to do final thoughts here in a second. Just quick note, what we provide to companies, through this whole thing is on the left, managed detection response. So we help people prepare for an event. We help people detect an event. We help people respond to an event. And on the right, with the risk assessments that you got to do, you have to do to set your security priorities, vulnerability scanning, pen testing, and then policy and compliance work. And I got to tell folks, the policy and compliance work has been really big recently as people set their policies and realize that their policies need an update. So, all right. There are a bunch more questions in the chat here. I'm going to ask one of them. Brian says, how do you, it's moving on me. Sorry about that. Brian says, where's Brian's question? How do you deal with the risk of your business associates simply lying on third-party assessments? Fred?
So the key is collecting artifacts during your assessment. So it's not just, here's the questionnaire. It says we are logging all access to healthcare data. Okay, they check the box, they say yes. Then you say, okay, I'd like you to provide some sample of that access. I'm going to pick 3 dates out and pick random dates and say, I want me to show an hour's worth of access on your EHR to this particular system. Show me that artifact, that snippet of the logs, showing me that you're actually doing what you said you're doing. So the key, and this is what the audit approach uses, this is how auditors validate that what you're telling them is true, is you have to go through a prove it stage. And that's produce an artifact, produce the document, the policy, show me the technology is acting as you say it is by showing the output of that technology. That would show that it is alerting, that it is logging, that it is monitoring these systems. So going beyond the spreadsheet and saying a little bit of prove it by showing me some examples, right, on why this stuff is in place. So that's the best way. If somebody's stupid enough to be lying to you on a BAA, it will come back to haunt them at some point, especially if there's an incident. That will allow you to crush them in terms of damages in a court, but at the same time, they may go out of business and you may not have anything to collect from anyway. So that's maybe not the best answer there.
Okay, 2 more quick pieces of business here. Number 1, my colleague Ginny is going to put a survey in the chat. Couple things. We've never done an urgent panel before. We've covered 3 issues. We'd love your opinion. Did this work? Did this not work? We get better based on your comments. So please take the survey. We would really appreciate it. Also, at the end of the survey, you can donate a gift card to Girls Who Code, which is a great charity, or you can get a gift card yourself if you want that. All right. The last thing is, if you want to get in touch with us, email my colleague Ellie or call the 800 number 24/7. We're here for you. And let's do final thoughts. Mike, final thoughts.
Healthcare in the United States is on the ropes, largely because of the difference between the public harm suffered by these acts and the private responsibility to make it not happen. And I think there needs to be more government involvement. Make sure that you are understanding your exposure to this exchange problem right now, and don't be Joe Sullivan.
Fred,
yeah,
final thoughts.
So I'm gonna make a recording because it's probably been the same one I've been signing off with on the last year, and that is, if you've got critical severity vulnerabilities that are exposed to the internet, for heaven's sake, call an incident, get those patched. It's literally the fuse is lit on the keg of dynamite. And if you don't do something, it's going to blow up.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Fred and Mike, thank you for putting this together. We always appreciate it. We always do urgent panels.
You make me do these things, Jake.
That's true, I do. Well, I'm going to thank you publicly anyway.
Okay.
We will continue to do urgent panels as these things come up. We'll email you about it. You can always go to our website, criticalinsight.com, click on events and see what's upcoming. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and have a great day.
And thanks to the great point you just made, Margaret, because I agree. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.